There have been many different answers to this question, and I think acknowledging the diversity of the socialist tradition and the need to study all of those differences of opinion, I would put at the forefront. The set of answers that I have found most persuasive, and that is kind of at the center of the article that you alluded to, come from the work of Nikos Poulantzas, who was a Greek-French sociologist who lived from the 30s to the 70s. A major focus of his was the state. What is the state? How should we think about it as socialists? How should we relate to it as a site of political struggle? His work on the state is enormously rich, and his views evolve over the years. But in his late work, in particular, an essay that he wrote called Towards a Democratic Socialism, there are a couple of takeaways that I wanted to just present to folks that I think are particularly useful. The first takeaway is kind of more analytic. It has to do with how should we think about the state. And Poulantzas argues that, very broadly speaking, the state has been conceptualized by socialists in one of two ways. The first is the kind of classical Leninist revolutionary tradition, which has tended to see the state as a mechanical expression of dominant class interests. This is somewhat of a caricature of Lenin's own position, but I think is maybe broadly true of the Leninist tradition, which is seeing the state as a more or less monolithic entity that functions in a fully integrated, non-contradictory way to reproduce capitalist class power. And as you might expect, that conception of the state invites a particular strategic orientation. The state is a fortress to be encircled, attacked, demolished. In particular, in the Leninist view, of course, the state is challenged and eventually superseded by organs of directly democratic popular power, such as workers' councils. This is the classic theory of dual power, which is developed out of the Russian revolutionary experience. The other way that socialists have viewed the state, broadly speaking, is from the social democratic tradition. And here, and again, I acknowledge this is a bit of a caricature, but I think this is a useful reduction. Here, the view is that the state is an apparatus that can be wielded for any purpose, provided a party gets enough votes. So a socialist party, if it's voted into power, can use the state straightforwardly to go about building socialism, however that is defined. So you can see these maybe as occupying two poles of a spectrum. The Leninist perspective attributes no autonomy to the state. The state is a machine, kind of automatically reproduces capitalist class power and can only do that. And the social democratic perspective attributes full autonomy to the state. The state kind of sits above capitalist class society and can act as a completely neutral arbiter. So for Poulantzas, as you might expect, he's kind of setting these poles up to disagree with both of them. And for him, crucially, the state is neither monolithic nor neutral. So it's neither a fortress to encircle and demolish, or an instrument that can be applied to any goal that one wants. Rather, it's what he calls the condensation of a particular class relationship of forces. So what does that actually mean? I think it means that the state is a site, is a creature of class struggle. In the words of Raphael Khachaturian, another DSA member who's written widely on Poulantzas, the state is a constellation of social forces and powers to which the class struggle is imminent. So more concretely, what that might mean is, against the Leninist conception, the state is complex and contradictory. And I think we see this kind of in our daily lives all the time. It's not simply this kind of hulking fortress of bourgeois rule. Rather, and this is really the crucial point for Poulantzas, the state is a field of struggle. So fights between classes and fractions of classes are constantly erupting across it. But, and this is a kind of a crucial caveat here, if the state is a field of struggle, it's still a field that remains heavily tilted in capital's favor. So it's not an open field where everyone kind of has an equal number of soldiers or whatever the metaphor is. It's one that is heavily tilted against socialist transformation. So Poulantzas is not arguing by using this phrase condensation of class forces that the state is like a snapshot of the balance of class forces at any given moment. Like you just have to build up your forces and then the state is yours. Because of course there are these deeply embedded state structures that have developed over centuries of capitalist class hegemony. And we see this, in the United States. It's not something that one can dislodge overnight, even in a situation in which you have a more favorable balance of class forces. So the state remains very much a capitalist state. And that means, on the whole, it acts to reproduce capitalist class rule. Polanskis has a famous formulation here, which is the purpose of the state is to organize the dominant classes and disorganize the dominated classes. And it does this with police by beating people up. It does this through ideological apparatus and so on. For this reason, the social democratic conception of the state as a neutral instrument is equally mistaken. It's not a matter of getting enough socialists elected and then legislating our way to socialism. Such efforts inevitably run aground, but where does that leave us, practically speaking? And this is, I think, where we have a second takeaway from this essay of Polanskis's. And the second takeaway, the first one was more analytical. How do we think about the state? I think the second is a bit more strategic. It has to do with, well, what do we do? If the state is a field of struggle, although, as we said with the caveat, one that is heavily tilted in capital's favor, how should socialists relate to it? He proposes a two-pronged approach, waging one struggle inside the state and one struggle outside of it. So the struggle inside the state would involve transforming the state by shifting the relationship of class forces within it. So not simply infiltrating and wielding the state in the kind of social democratic conception that he's critiquing, but radically altering state structures, like remaking what the state is, how it functions. The latter struggle, which would occur outside of the state, would involve cultivating another form of power, what Polanskis calls popular power, by assembling new institutions of direct democracy and self-management from below. So you might think of unions, cooperatives, neighborhood assemblies, tenants associations, even the classical Soviets, these institutions that tend to emerge and develop in periods of mobilization where ordinary people come together and can make democratic decisions about how to organize the conditions of their own lives. Now, crucially, the reason he wants to do these together is because he feels that if you're doing both, the two can inhibit one another's worst tendencies, like statism and authoritarianism, and bring out their shared democratic potential. So importantly, this is not an argument for dual power, because as you recall, the dual power argument is that you have these new institutions from below, like the Soviets, that are going to, at some point, overtake the state. I mean, at least in Lenin's conception in State and Revolution, the Soviet replaces the Tsarist state. What Polanskis is suggesting here is something more dialectical, like the two struggles are actually kind of interacting, and struggles inside the state are meant to create more space for struggles outside the state and vice versa. So you kind of have these two layers of struggle that are kind of bringing out the best in each other, we might say. And I think also this is an important point, that it's not just about the kind of momentum or energy that's provided through struggle from below, but that struggle from below can generate the kind of creativity that we need to remake the state. In other words, that these grassroots structures of self-rule and self-provisioning that Polanskis calls popular power, and which we might call autonomy, can supply the energy and the inspiration and also like the ideas for remaking the state. Now, for Polanskis, there is still a need for a revolutionary rupture, but it's one that comes about through these combined struggles. It's not a simply insurrectionary frontal assault on the state fortress. It's kind of like this more dialectical process that eventually generates a series of breaks. Polanskis is developing these ideas at a time in the 70s when both the kind of capital C communist and the old social democratic parties are facing these real crises, kind of identity crises. This is, obviously in retrospect, we know is kind of the beginning of neoliberalism too, and this kind of collapse of the classical workers movement. And the question of what a socialist path forward should look like in an advanced capitalist country was very much an open question. And Polanskis's response to this crisis was to develop a synthesis, one that combined elements of classical social democracy with Leninism, but which also incorporated lessons from the new social movements of the 60s and 70s. And what he came up with was a vision of social transformation that paired an emphasis on the need for kind of formal liberal rights, parliamentary representative institutions, but also directly democratic institutions. So it's kind of this very pluralistic ecology of structures and forces that kind of extend through all sites of social life, and which, centrally involved but are not limited to the terrain of the state. It feels like a bit of a down moment for the left, or a relatively quiet moment. We've had so much momentum over the past decade with Occupy and BLM and the two Bernie campaigns and the George Floyd uprising. And now I feel like we're at an ebb or maybe like stagnation. But I think this is actually, as maybe dispiriting as kind of down moments can be, it's also a really good moment to take an opportunity to reflect on what the long-term vision is. Because like when things are really popping off, you're like, oh, this is really exciting. But actually, a moment like this, it's kind of nice to like sit back and be like, okay, well, what's actually the vision here? Like, what is the content of socialism? Most socialists, for much of the 20th century, had actually pretty clear vision of like what the path to socialism was and what it was going to look like. I think the answers were wrong, as we saw from much of the 20th century, but they did have the content. And I think, a big question for us is, what is this socialism of the 21st century actually look like? And I think the past can be very useful in studying, the achievements and the limitations of our predecessors. But, the historical cycle that made those movements legible, that made the kind of isms that we study, people like Lenin and Kautsky and Luxemburg and others, that moment has passed. And I think the critical thing now is that we are really living in a different era. I mean, Polancis was living at a time when, the Social Democratic and the Communist parties were in crisis. And now we're living at a time when those traditions are really just dead. And it doesn't mean that we don't have anything to learn from them and that we can't be inspired by them. But we're not in the historical cycle that generated them and made them legible. We're not in the 20th century anymore. So I don't think that's a recipe for despair, because there's plenty of practical work to do, particularly in a country as regressive as the United States. But I think we do need to be honest with ourselves about the need for renewal and regeneration. And DSA, I think, is a great place to do that, because it's a big tent ecumenical organization, where I think a lot of the types of syntheses that someone like Polancis would say are necessary to overcome this type of crisis can emerge.